Well, we are live. Welcome, everyone. We've been having a little bit of technical difficulties. We've lost a couple of our people. I see them starting to come back now, but we will get this started so that we can keep it in our time frame. Welcome to our virtual 2019 Vintage Preview Part 1. We are going through a bit of a crazy time right now, but that doesn't mean that winemaking has stopped, and we want to make sure that we get a chance to taste all of these amazing wines and let everyone know what is available from the 2019 vintage. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There are files on the side to the right where you'll find the text sheets for all of the wine and our 2019 vintage report. We also will be taking questions at the end of the discussion, so you can go into the chat and put your questions in at any time, and we'll get to those at the end of the discussion. And I'm going to now turn it over to Barbara Phillips, our Master of Wine and our moderator for today.
Welcome, everyone. I'd like to call this part 1 of the virtual 2019 Vintage Media Preview, Cooler Climates, Wines with Finesse. And even though the climates that we're talking about today will differ, I would argue that the way they're manifest in the wines really epitomizes the freshness and the crispness that we expect from BC cooler climates. It's a strange setup. I mean, we're used to drinking wine and sharing wine together face to face, and hopefully if we're patient, we'll be able to do that soon. But in the meantime, I'm so happy that we could arrange to be together in this virtual way. And one of the benefits is, if you look at the list of participants, of audience participants today, it's nationwide. So a particular hello to everybody across Canada who's joined us today. I want to thank our panelists too, and we'll be talking to them about very specific things for their vineyards and the weather patterns of 2019. But I wanted to start with just a look at some of the overview of what the vintage looked like. So, all right. So this slide, and I'm sure everybody can see it, it is of Summerland, and we don't have wines from Summerland today. And of course, the specific figures are going to be different whether we're on the island or in Lake Country or Kelowna. But really, the pattern, particularly for vineyards in the interior of BC, is the same, the shape of the graph. And isn't it nice to look at a graph about something other than COVID-19? The shape of the graph is pretty representative about what happened across the province. So you can see that really it was a fairly average year if we look at it against a 10-year average, and even more in some cases. Although it's interesting because before I looked at the data, I was hearing from a lot of people, oh, it was a cooler vintage. The wines are really showing that crispness and bright acidity of a cool vintage, but actually the numbers overall, if you look at growing degree days, don't really bear that out. Which I guess there's two things to say about that. One is growing degree days, as we know, don't tell the whole story anyway, they're an indication. But also the particularities of any year really come down to a month by month, what's happening in the growing season. So the next slide here is just more focused on the regions that we're going to talk about today. And these are from the weather stations in Kelowna East and the North Cowichan. And you can see again that against the 10-year average, the growing degree days, while slightly less, were pretty normal, we're pretty average. So that's something, panelists, as we're getting toward speaking to you and some of us tasting the wines, think about if you believe that to be true or not. Was it really a cooler vintage? Is it an average vintage that manifests cooler? What's the deal with it? So here's a pretty complicated slide. I'll leave it up for a while you look at it. And it's a month by month of the growing season. Again, Summerland data, but the pattern of this is going to be reflected through most growing regions, particularly in the interior. So the key points, and many of you will remember it, and I know we have winemakers and vineyard managers tuned in today, so you'll certainly remember the start of the year where we had an unusually warm January, some days with temperatures above 10 degrees. And of course, what that does is it kind of gives a nudge to the vines to wake up a little bit too early. So we did have some bud and vine damage when the cold temperatures returned in February. And of course, what does that result in? It results in low yields. It results in a little bit uneven maturation of the vines. So we'll talk about that more with our panelists. April started cool, but May and June were quite warm. So the vines caught up basically to their normal flowering times. And if you remember in 18, a lovely, generally cool vintage as well, there was a lot of snow runoff. So throughout the year, really, we had this excellent moisture in the soil with lots of vigor, etc. We didn't have that in 19. July and August were warm, but didn't have, especially for Summerland and North, didn't have the heat spikes that we often have in BC growing regions. And notably, something else that has become a factor in our terroir, if you will, we didn't really have smoke cover. And that has been a factor in recent years, as you'll remember. We were still making up for some of the damage that happened in the early part of the growing season or in the late part of the winter, reducing yields, much selection needed in the vineyard. September, and again, vineyard managers, winemakers will probably have each day in September memorized, started warm and dry, but then about mid-September, temperatures cooled and the rains came. This drew out the harvest, and I'd like to hear from the panelists. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And I assume that it depends on what style of wine you're making, where your vineyard is located, and what grape varieties you're harvesting. October was sunny and dry, but then Thanksgiving weekend, there was a frost. So many people still having grapes on the vine were at risk after that. Okay. And then the island, which is very exciting. We're so excited to have Chris on the panel today. This is against a 7-year average for the North Cowichan weather station. So you can see that 19 was, pretty average as far as growing degree days. And it started off quite dry with an early bud break. The growing season was a little wetter than normal, and as is typical in the region, no frost pressure. But we're going to hear more details about Cowichan when we talk to Chris Turyk, marketing specialist from Unsworth Vineyards. So, Chris, you brought a couple of wines. I'm lucky enough to have them here. We can taste along together. So I want you to talk about the particularities of your sites in 2019. And I had a particular question too, because you've really been an experimentalist and an advocate of hybrid grape varieties and grape varieties that do particularly well on the island. So I was wondering, to what extent has your selection of grape varieties mitigated the effective vintage and ensured the consistent ripeness and quality of your crop?
I don't think we can hear Chris.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Are you on mute?
No, Chris, we can't hear you, and we want to hear you. We were hearing you earlier, no problem. Shoot.
Maybe we can come back to Chris.
Okay. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Let's get him figured out, because we absolutely do want to hear what happened on the island.
Absolutely.
All right. So Chris, if you can hear us, stand by. We'll come back to you. And in the meantime, then, Nikki, are you ready?
I think so. Can you hear me?
All right.
Can hear you.
So we have Nikki Callaway, winemaker at O'Rourke's Peak Cellars. And you've brought today the Gewürztraminer that I know we've talked a little bit about before, and the Rosé. And you're new at O'Rourke's, and O'Rourke's is new. We don't know much about it, so we're going to be really excited to learn. And, you know, obviously, you're still exploring the overall climatic features of Lake Country and your vineyards. The vineyards are young. So you're doing that at the same time as following the vintage and managing the vines in the growing season. Are there aspects of 19 that you can see manifest in the wines, or is it too early to tell? Do you not have enough of a body of examples so that you can tell?
I think that the answer to that question is yes to everything. There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, like you brought up. This was my first vintage up in Lake Country at the peak. So that's part of the variable, getting to know the new blocks, getting to know the aspect, getting to know the site. We are 100% estate and 100% Lake Country, so there's no variable in fruit from other parts of the valleys. So that kind of does demonstrate exactly what we can do up here and what the vintage can demonstrate. The younger vines, I think that's a very important, again, piece of the puzzle. Most of the vines were planted in about 2013, 14, and 15. Again, so we're not even 10-year-old vines. And if I sit and I think a little bit of, I was a young vine, what kind of vintage would I like to be living? And I think that a more moderate, cooler style vineyard harvest would probably be beneficial. No massive heat waves, no stress. I don't have to shut down. I can keep going every day. And some days are a little warmer, I get a bit of a tan, and some days I may need to put a sweater, but, you know, feel more balanced. And I think that vines do like balance. The other advantage I think we have with some of these young vines is they are extremely low vigor and there's not a lot of canopy. We're not pushing these vines very hard, they're babies. And so in a vintage where disease pressure was quite scary and present, we had extremely low yields. There was a lot of, airflow through the vineyards, and we didn't have bunches crowding each other, causing more, disease pressure to kind of progress in the vineyards. And all of that added up to what I believe to be a very kind vintage for us. I also believe it has to do with the winemaker and the winemaking and the styles of wine that you want to make. And I'm a huge believer in balance. I'm a huge believer in flavor. I don't need to pick on numbers. I don't need to pick on berry shrivel or on overextending ripeness. And 2019, with the site, with the young vines, with everything we had, was pretty impressive for us. I know other vineyards had issues, and it may not be the same across the block, so I don't stand on the roof and scream that out. But now with the wines in the bottle and tasting them, I think they still do demonstrate, just like you said, Barb, the finesse, the elegance, the lower alcohol. I hate this word, but I don't know how better to explain it, but there's tension. And all 6 of these glasses, there's this restraint, but still elegant. You can tell there's fruit, but there's still, they're a little shy. And I think that as I'm the lucky one, it's 10 o'clock in the morning and I get to taste all the wines. 200 other people aren't doing that, so I apologize. But getting to these wines, Barb, you can chat with me because you have them as well. I do want to start with the first one, which is the single block rosé. This goes back to the age of vines. So this is a baby. This is planted in 2016. This was the first year that there was any crop from this block. I fell in love with the clone 828 at Quailsgate on the Manhart Vineyard down on that sandy soil in West Kelowna. This is a young block of 828. I can see this in the future being an exceptional, big, beautiful Pinot, but I wasn't going to push it this year. There's no way in heck the little baby is going to make me an amazing Pinot. So what do from a first pick of maybe maximum 90 cases we made, and that demonstrates exactly what your question that you posed me. How does this vintage manifest in young vines? So Would you answer the question now, Barb? I'll throw it back at you.
Well, I think certainly both of these wines do seem very happy in the glass. So these are happy young vines. And I think what's interesting, especially if you think about the future of this rosé, and it's delicious and crisp, but there's a texture on the palate. There's a texture, and maybe concentration is a bit of a too much of a word, but there's a very distinct red currant, red fruit flavor on the palate that reminds me of a pure red wine rather than a rosé. But here you have the wine itself is very light, is very fresh. So it's interesting that it's sort of got those characteristics, just like I guess a toddler would. You can see the red wine that this has the potential to be one day. And the Gewürztraminer, I know you want to talk about that because this is a pretty special wine, and I think it's clearly Gewürztraminer on the nose, but not overwhelmingly so. And I think again, this is about the texture.
Proverbial little girl, when it's good, Gewürztraminer is fantastic, but when it's bad, it's awful. I know there's a lot of people that refuse to have another sip of Gewürztraminer ever in their life, which is unfortunate. Sometimes I like to say that it reminds me of my grandmother's underwear drawer. It's that potpourri, lavender, rose petal, cloying with residual sugar. You have one sip and you have your sugar high and you say you're never going to have another glass of Gewürztraminer. And I think that's unfortunate. I am not a Gewürztraminer drinker, but I'm really pushing for this resurgence of a beautiful Gewürztraminer. And I think probably David Tantalus is going to rip out all his Riesling and plant Gewürztraminer after he tastes this lovely wine.
Maybe I'll take a few tons from you this year.
Okay. So we played around a lot with fermenting. So again, to compare with young vines is the first glass, which was the first harvest ever for that block. The Gewürztraminers have a little bit more age up here in Lake Country, which again is maybe maximum 7-8 years. Does show a little bit more weight in the palate. And we did quite a lot of fermenting on skins. We have some 2-ton fermenters for the Pinot Noir, and they were sitting empty. So we did 12-day skin contact, fermented them, punched down just like a Pinot Noir. We did stainless steel ferments. There was some barrel ferments as well. So there's a mixture of winemaking styles, as well as a mixture of different blocks on the site. And what I really love about it is, the nose is vibrant and elegant and soft still, but the palate has weight and austerity and is not too overly cloying or, demonstrating this grandma's underwear drawer Gewürztraminer. It's a lot more of an elegant style. And again, is that the vintage? Is that how much we did for harvest? Is it the style we're going towards? Those are questions I think we're going to start to look at in the future, because I would like to see at least 2 Gewürztraminers in our portfolio and just try to push directions of block, maybe aspect, site, clone, winemaking. There's so many variables that we can work with, but just to demonstrate that Gewürztraminer can be more than just one glass.
Fabulous. And also in the best cases has really exciting potential to age as well. Thanks, Nikki. Can we check back in with Chris and see if we can hear him?
Am I here?
Chris, you there, Chris?
Now?
Yeah.
Oh, fabulous. You know how much I like the sound of my...
Now we hear him, but we don't see him.
No.
I can see myself.
I can
see small Chris and a beautiful picture of the vineyard.
Okay. Into it. The workhorse for Unsworth and indeed the island is Pinot Noir. There's no disputing that. And the way we've set up our portfolio, it really utilizes the beauty and the diversity that Pinot Noir can offer, from traditional method sparkling through to rosé sparkling. Charmat method, which Charndelil is, our still rosé, and then where our cream of the crop, our best vineyard sites, and in the case of the past couple of years, our best vineyard site, grown very dedicated and studious vineyard managers and owners and Frederick and Ingrid from Saison. So we don't have to compromise with the quality of our red Pinot because we have these other ways that we can utilize Pinot Noir, be it still sparkling, still rosé, sparkling rosé, or in a blend. And then other things we do with our second wine that I'm pouring is Allegro. So it's a blend of two varieties that ripen about 2 weeks apart, and they give really complementary characteristics to the blend. So we're able to kind of, and we're small region and a small, relatively small winery. So we're able to kind of pick and choose these different little micro plots and within vineyards in some cases throughout the valley. And if one variety is up in crop and one crop level and one variety is down, or one block is more ripe than the others, we have a lot of options what we can do with these wines to maintain our house style, to really showcase our best vineyards and the best vineyards we work with. And so it's kind of a beautiful thing to have all these different clones, all these different varieties, while still having a focus on Pinot Noir and of course Pinot Gris.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too. I mean, Nikki says she hates the term tension, and I'm not sure why, because that's a beautiful thing to find in wine. But I know a lot of people hate the term minerality, and as wine professionals, people make fun of us when we use it. But I have to say that it's certainly present in your wines. And even living in Vancouver, I don't get a chance to try a wide variety of wines from the island. But I would say that it's something you do find there. There's a saltiness, a minerality. And do you think that's something that's innate to the terroir there? Do you think it's something that changes from vintage to vintage? Do you agree with me that it's there? What are your comments on that?
Yeah. I have hallmark island style, and it's this the kind of, electric quality or searing minerality that I find is pretty present in island wines and indeed a lot of climate wines. I don't know whether it has to do something with the acidity or just the constituent makeup of the grape variety. But yeah, it's a master sommelier once in a coaching session said that minerality is kind of a drying sensation behind the teeth on the hard palate, and I get that across the board with island wine, and it's something that we can really hang our hat on, because I know it's pretty well accepted that it's a marker for quality in wine, and I think it's something that really drives our style and that we can all celebrate.
And I think you used the term electric, right? And is that? I'm just wondering if electric is where tension and minerality meet, and who wouldn't want to drink that?
Oh,
and Chris, you might have talked about it when you didn't realize that we couldn't hear you. But just if you could, what were the particularities about 2019 for you in the vineyard and in the wines?
I think you outlined it quite well. It kind of showed a little bit riper than the numbers may indicate. I'm not seeing my own video. Am I?
I'm not seeing it either.
We can hear you.
We can hear you though.
No, we don't.
That's probably the most important part. I don't know. It's it must be above iron-rich blood, or I don't know what's going on here. I am a millennial. I know how to use devices, and I'm blaming this on technology right now. What was I on about? Oh yeah, it seemed pretty a little bit riper than the numbers may indicate. It was kind of a nice even year. We didn't suffer from the January kind of influx of temperature like I know some of my friends in the Similkameen sure did. But we saw the same kind of inversion of temperature, but it wasn't disastrous. But yeah, it's kind of an even vintage. The rains came every so often throughout the growing season. Not torrential downpours for weeks on end or even days on end. It's kind of this even, steady vintage, and what it led to was the acids were actually absolutely spot on, especially for that kind of tension and that electricity that I know I certainly look for in wine. But the sugars were not as high as we've seen them in years like 15 and 17. So a lot of the lighter styles, the sparklings and rosé are real standouts this year. And as far as harvest is concerned, yeah, we did get some. The rains held off until about mid-September, and we got a good dump. But a lot of the vineyards fared fairly well. The grapes weren't degrading, beyond any reasonable level, and we got it dried out in the early part of October, so we were able to kind of relax a little bit and pull the grapes in the early part of October, red Pinot and some of the later ripening varieties. So it was a fair vintage. We've seen worse harvests or more challenging harvests. But in the words of Burgundy, it was a classic vintage, not an exceptional vintage.
Well, we look forward to, and from what you were saying earlier, I mean, these wines are fresh and mineral and exciting and electrical, all the things we've talked about. But really, it sounds like the vintage, in a sense, is not judged, but is measured, or can really only be evaluated when we see how the Pinot does, when we see how the red Pinot does, because that's something that's more uncertain and is vulnerable to the vintage more. So we look forward to trying those.
Yeah,
thanks, Chris.
Even for us, red Pinot, it is a privilege. It's not a right. So it's we really do try and equal the amount of work that's put into the vineyard with what we do in the winery.
Fabulous. Well, you always do a good job. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
We'll come back to you for the
difficulties, but I'm glad I could hear my own voice for a little bit.
Well, it was great to see you and hear you, even if it wasn't at the same time. Oh, there's some beautiful pictures of Nikki. Just before we go over to David, did you have anything you wanted to say about these beautiful pictures in way of explanation for Works Peak?
No, not necessarily. They're green vines overlooking the lake, which could be anywhere in the Okanagan from those pictures, but it's pretty, regardless of where you are in the valley, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. That's always so proud when people come from away to visit our vineyards. Hi, David. David Paterson, winemaker at Tantalus. You've sent over some zippy, vibrant, austere Riesling and the delicious rosés. So I want to talk about those. And you do hear about this cooler vintage, and maybe people are thinking about the end of September only when they're talking about cooler vintage. But would you agree that the wines taste like they're from a bit of a cooler vintage? And sometimes you hear people quoted when they talk about a vintage that's extended or a little bit cooler, especially in the final phase of ripening, how this adds to flavor development, especially in noble grape varieties like say the Riesling. Would you agree with that? And if you do agree with it, what's happening? Why is that the case?
Yeah, so I definitely do agree with that. I mean, firstly, 2019 I think was affected by the winter very considerably right up and down the valley. And we found in very strange pockets across our vineyard where we would have complete top death, and then water shoots would come out the bottom. So the vine's not dead, but it's not giving us any fruit. I also found a lot of the tertiary buds that pushed would maybe have a few bunches on it, but they were 2 or 3 weeks behind the rest of the canopy and the rest of the fruit. And while we all sort of talked about that flowering did catch up, I think in some of those tertiary buds that were a few weeks behind, they stayed behind the entire time. And I think that's actually a good thing in a lot of ways in these 2019s, because it's given us some layers and some complexity in the juice when you're picking the whole block. But you've got some grapes that you could test at 19.5 bricks, while the juice was really 21.5 when you picked the whole block. But you've still got some of these berries adding some very sort of interesting, savory, saline tension that Nikki was talking about to the wines. And so that made it very exciting, I think. As far as, you know, cool vintages and being better vintages, I think when I look and taste the Rieslings off this property, my favorites are 2005, 2008, 2011, and now 2019, and they're all cool vintages. And I think that is a result of being able to lay down flavor without getting a huge sugar spike. So we've still got very flavorful, intense wines with lovely texture, but they don't have 13.6, 14.1 alcohol. We're talking in the 12s for a lot of these wines, and but still with the weight and the tension that we're looking for. So to answer your question, what's happening in the vineyard, I just think it comes down to sugar accumulation. When you've got that cooler September, instead of packing on sugar and therefore potential alcohol, the vine's still doing something, but it's packing on flavor and phenolics and all the things that make wine interesting, but not necessarily packing on as much sugar and potential alcohol. So I think that's what's made this vintage very, very good.
Very interesting. And then, I mean, just looking at the silver lining or the glass half full about the problems in January, February actually adding to make a more complex wine.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we had lower crops and we had some weird things to contend with in the vineyard towards the start. And when do you shoot thin when you've got buds that are 3 weeks apart in their maturity, things like that. But once we got through all of that and got into the rest of the growing season, we didn't have those huge heat spikes that shut the vines down. So they just continued trucking on flavor but not necessarily a lot of sugar. And then cooler September. I'll take the 19 vintage apart from the winter damage any day. I really enjoyed it. We had the cleanest grapes I've ever seen. Yeah, just beautiful. And that's a testament to our grape grower, to Felix, really getting into his job. It's his second season, and you know, I'm very excited for the next 5 years with all of the things that he's putting in place with cover crops and no-till management of soil and things. But yeah, I mean, I look at the 19 vintage as a viticulturist vintage to start with. If you didn't get it right in the vineyard, you could get really badly hurt in the 2019. And I have heard those stories around the valley, but a lot of people did get it right. And those that got it right then gave their winemakers some very good juice to play with. And then the other part of terroir is that human factor of what did you do in the winery? How did you ferment your juice? When did you make your picking decisions? I think in 19 really mattered. I found with Riesling, we usually get about 2 or 3 windows of flavor on this vineyard, but those windows came and went quicker this year in some ways to really hit it properly. So we were making some very on-the-fly decisions, knowing suddenly this block is ready, let's pick it. But I think the results in the glass, I love the 19 Riesling. It's actually the lowest sugar we've ever been.
Wow.
And one of the lowest total acidities, but the pH is still low. So I think the balance is really, really nice in that wine, and it will age spectacularly well. There's layers, there's, you know, right from the subtropicals all the way down to that limey, pithy citrus. And yeah, I mean, look, in this climate right now, this is a wine that normally would sell out fairly quickly, and if it doesn't, it's just going to get better. So it's all good.
There's a beautiful core of fruit along with the austerity that you expect from this wine. And then you want to talk a little bit about the rosé. So this is Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier.
Yeah, so rosé is something that we've always made from the base of our 1985 plantings of Pinot Meunier that the Turyks planted for bubbles. I've never put it into bubbles before. I've always made it into rosé, and I think it's always been this beautiful core to our rosé. I leave the Meunier on skins for about 4 to 5 days because the anthocyanin in Pinot Meunier, the color molecule, is very unstable. where Pinot Noir is quite stable compared to it. And then I actually picked the Pinot Noir component just after the bubbles, so about 19.5 bricks. And I whole bunch press that. That gets no skin contact at all. So all the color and that texture and flavor comes from the old Meunier, and all the freshness and vibrancy comes from the Noir. This year we took it bone dry. We took a decent amount of it into neutral Pinot barrels. Probably about 15 to 20% of that wine was the Pinot, almost at bubble-based style, but done in old barrels. And then the rest fermented in stainless. 3 months on lees, filtered and bottled, nice and fresh and easy. And we're pretty stoked on that wine too. I think you're seeing a trend in rosé. I mean, you're looking at Nikki's as well, which is beautiful, beautiful, crisp, dry, light style. And we've been going that way too. I've always left 3 to 4 grams in rosé. This year, it's about 1.2. So basically bone dry, and with slightly higher acid than previous years. So really, in some ways following the world trend in rosé, but just realizing that these drier styles are beautiful. Reese Pender did a video on rosé a few days ago and talked about being in no man's land with rosé, and you're either that sweet, easier, darker style, which still has its audience, or you need to be in this drier, crisper, more food-friendly style, which we've chosen to go, and we're very happy.
I love it, and maybe that's something that's emerging for rosés of BC, because just because of our circumstances, we don't have the lightness that people look for and that a lot of regions are chasing with the Provençal style. We're always going to have more intensity of fruit, but I think that that's a bonus, because you can make something that's bone dry, but it's balanced by the fruit, by the pure dry fruit.
I think that gave 2019 its hallmark is this high dry extract. So what we're tasting is a lot of, when we're talking about tension or minerality, really what that is a higher dry extract content, which helps balance the acidity, and you don't need as much sugar. So we're getting some of those savories and even that slightly pithiness that you get out of Provence rosés, mainly made from Grenache or other. But we're still getting it out of that style, out of Pinot, because we had that longer time on the vine, and therefore higher dry extract.
Mm-hmm. And I feel that in both of the rosés today, and Nikki's as well. Well, that's fabulous. We are already at 10:42. I know we've had some delays, but I think, I'm not sure if we mentioned this at the beginning, we're going to move to some questions now, so you can have questions for everybody. And we may, in fact, go a little bit longer than 10:45 with the questions, but know that if you ask a question on the chat and you have to leave, we'll still do our best to answer it, and it will show up in the video later. So I believe that the video will be on the BCWI YouTube channel very shortly after we finish here. So just to know, these wines that we were talking about today are released, they're ready to go and available. All right, David Lorison, well, welcome. So David Lorison asks, any report on how the later ripening reds fared in the south, given the poor end of the season? And David, you might want to join us next Wednesday when we talk about some of the more concentrated, warmer regions. But does anybody have an idea of this question?
I can speak to it. We made a little bit of red for a client, for a custom crush client from down south. I think that mirrored what we've already been saying. I think you're going to see those lower alcohols. I think if anyone over oaked their big reds this year, they're in a world of trouble. But those that were restrained with their oak and restrained with their extraction and their temperatures of ferment will have made more Bordeaux-esque wines than California-esque or Washington-esque wines this year. More elegance, hopefully a touch of the sagey greenness that you can get out of really good Bordeaux, but it will come down to extraction and how much oak they use as to the true quality. But I think there's a real chance of excellent big reds as well.
Lovely, thanks. Thanks for tackling that one, David. I appreciate it. And David Lorison, we will be talking more about that next Wednesday. Sid, hi Sid. Sid says, anxious to taste Nikki's 2019 Gewürz. Notes say fermented to dryness, but stats show 6.2 RS. Nikki, do you have an explanation for this? Was the text sheet not printed properly, or does that RS work well with the acidity balance? It certainly didn't taste like 6.2 grams to me, but you can tackle that.
I think it's more the balance of the wine. We always go too technical with exact numbers here, there, and everywhere, but to me, what is dryness? It depends on, again, what spectrum you're on and what different residual sugar sheet you go off of, and I've never really paid any attention to any of that. So to me, it's really well balanced. Gewürztraminers often have a lot more weight to them and can actually deal with a lot more residual and still hide it. They often have pHs that are more in that 3.4, 3.5, so they end up being a little flabby. So in order to keep that, retain them so that they're still in a nice soft palate, a little sugar to balance the acid. But to me, it's balanced. Maybe the text sheet and what Nikki says are different, but that's
I would have
keeping balance in my palate.
I would have blind tasted that wine as under 2 grams. It
Yeah,
feels dry.
Yeah, certainly tasted dry. And sorry, I don't have the text sheet in front of me. What is approximately the pH on this one? Pretty high acid.
Probably pretty close to 3.4, 5.7 TA, and somewhere around maybe 5.6 RS.
And certainly, I would certainly, if I was a sommelier or selling this to a customer, I would certainly call it a dry rosé. There's no question. Ashley asks, how does the Island Pinot this year differ from 2018?
Well, the 2019 just finished mallow, and the 18 just recently got bottled.
So they were presenting very differently.
Yeah, that's my roundabout way of saying we'll have to see a little bit. The 17 and 18 are definitely two different animals, and the 18 and 19 are 18 is probably closer to 19 than 18 is to 17, if that makes sense. But we're a real breadth of ripeness and a breadth of flavors, from that kind of tight, taut, brambly red fruit all the way to the classic. I mean, I always get dark cherry in Island Pinot, and it's a like a barely ripe dark cherry. It's not the stewed, dried cherry that you might expect from warmer regions in California, but it's always that kind of like taut, brambly red berry fruit through to the classic dark cherry, and as Dave said, you kind of get that kind of sagey greenness in some of the Bordeaux blends. I love the little bit of kind of just a touch of phenolic bitterness that adds just a little bit of complexity to that really bright fruit that epitomizes Island Pinot, and then we just don't throw too much oak at it.
I think that could be a theme when we're talking about reds. Ashley also adds that she loves Island Rosé and Pinot Noir, don't we all? And can't wait to travel back to Unsworth. Thanks, Ashley. And Janet Dorozinski, I'm not sure that this is a question. Oh, pardon me? And Janet Dorozinski says tension is much better than minerality. We welcome you, Janet, all the way from Ottawa, Ontario. Jill Nessel. Hello to Chris from Tourism Cowichan. So proud to be partners and excited to share the news of 2019 Allegro, which is delicious. Stacey Krause. Oh, connection lighting. Okay. Carolyn Tucker says, Granny Panty Goo. That's my Nikki. Yes, indeed. Looking for another question. Many people panicked that they couldn't hear you, Chris.
Just while you're looking for it, we should all say happy birthday to Nikki. Only it's your birthday.
Happy birthday!
Thanks, Dave.
You're
Happy
welcome.
birthday,
Thank
Happy
you.
birthday. Cheers.
Everybody's having an unbirthday this year. I get to celebrate it with how many people? 250 and drink wine at 10 in the morning. So, not bad.
That's a good start.
Happy 25th.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, so I have a question from Ernest Keynes. Does it matter if growing degree days come at the beginning, middle, or late in the season? I'm certain that it does, but who would like to tackle this, and maybe specific to how the growing degree days accumulated in the 19 growing season?
I can take it if you want.
Perfect, thank you.
It matters a lot when the growing degree days come. Warm spring means, if you accumulate a lot in spring, you get a lot of vegetative growth very quickly, which can mean you get behind a little bit in the vineyard if that explosion happens in the vineyard. If you get it in the middle, you can get vine shutdown as well. A lot of where I think growing degree days falls down is a lot of vines, especially these cooler climate varieties that we're talking about, will shut down around 34, 35 degrees. So if we've got 40-degree days, they're not actually opening their stomata and completing photosynthesis. They end up doing a lot more photosynthesis at night, which is called C4. I'm not going to go too technical on that, but it means that things like Riesling and Pinot Noir will shut down completely and can therefore end up presenting as cooler vintage style wines at the end because they didn't keep on trucking. Where 19, I think, it was a very even accumulation. So we didn't get any of the stop-start in the vines. And then obviously I touched on it earlier with the growing degree days coming late. So let's say September and into October. You can get a huge spike in potential alcohol and be forced to pick earlier than you would like for flavor development, or risk being very high in alcohol. So it really does matter where that accumulation comes. And although growing degree days is a nice little thing to talk about and a graph to talk about, it doesn't often capture all of those variables. So it's very hard to just look at a growing degree day and go, that is a cool season or that's hot. It gives you an overview, but there is a lot of variables that go into how those wines present.
The other part of that variable too, Dave, is that that's all from Summerland. And, Lake Country is going to be a lot different than East Kelowna, which is different than West Kelowna, which is different than Unsworth. So they're a generalization, and I think we have to always respect that for what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I have a question for Chris from Jake. Is the future of island red wines likely to include Foch?
Oh God, let's hope not. No, obviously that's personal opinion, which doesn't have much place in the wine industry. One single data point, just like growing degree days, it's one single data point, and it's no. We work very hard to make our port style wine, which is 100% Maréchal Foch, and over 10 years now, we've managed to work it into something that we're quite proud of. And I know Avril Creek is doing very interesting things. They're doing kind of a ripasso method with Pinot skins into Foch to kind of give it a little bit more complexity, a little bit more finesse, because it does have some redeeming qualities. It just, it takes a little bit, no variety is perfect. So it just takes a little bit of finesse, and, it doesn't help that it burns when you spray it with sulfur, and that it has these big dinner plate sized leaves that cover the clusters. So, just like anything, it's there. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there's redeeming things to anything. So that's what we're interested in finding. I want to look for the good in things, but yeah, as far as taking our wines and showcasing them at events like this, I think Pinot probably is a little bit more globally understood, shall we say, than Foch at this point. But yeah.
Fair enough. I think this next question, you've touched on it a little bit, panelists, but Carl is asking in particular, for a cooler versus a warmer vintage, would you vary the amount of stainless versus oak fermenting?
Me personally, yes. I don't ferment much in oak apart from Chardonnay, and a little bit of rosé and neutral barrel, which when we talk about oak, we're usually talking about first and second use oak, and therefore the impact of oak on a wine. Warmer vintages with bigger fruit can handle a little bit more oak, I find, than the cooler vintages. I backed off this year. I increased the whole bunch, which is maybe counterintuitive to some people, but I find that it manages the tannins really well when we have more stems in our Pinot. And then I backed off on the new oak, down under 20% this year for the first time. But yeah, I think that there is, those are considerations every winemaker should be looking at every year, and not just recipe winemaking.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? In agreement?
We've only ever fermented Pinot in stainless, so yeah, there's.
Fair enough. And I have a question. I'm not sure who has the data for this, but Barbara Wild is asking, how did the rain affect the overall harvest numbers in 19? Does anyone have a sense of that?
One thing I found was that we picked bubbles quite early because it was on that track of being more of a warm vintage, and then with that September and then the rains, you know, I was bottling first week of September as well, so we basically picked bubbles while we were bottling, and then I was like, right, we're going to be straight into Chardonnay and Rosé here. It's tracking like that, and then we didn't pick anything else for another 2.5, 3 weeks after that. So it kind of stalled it in a lot of ways, but that's where we accumulated flavor, not sugar, which was great. So I think the cooler September and those rains actually really helped the overall quality.
And to add to that, I mean, what I did see sometimes also doing a lot of maturity assessment and trying to figure out the balance of the grapes before they get picked. Rain always affects that, can dilute it one way or another. And I think initially I thought a lot was due to rain and swelling of the berries, and so I get lower bricks versus when we started to actually press them and bring them in. But I think it's more related to the initial thing that Dave said about there was so much of a variable in certain blocks due to how the different buds and the timing of the tertiaries. And I think that is the most pivotal part of why numbers were not what you should have been going by in 19. It had to have been flavors, because doing an analysis in the vineyards were so different than when you pressed. Was it due to rain? Was it due to the season? Was it due to tons of variables? Everything. But it really was difficult to pinpoint by numbers if you should be picking or not, and it just demonstrates itself.
I stopped running numbers and just did everything by flavor.
Yeah.
And then ran them once we'd pressed the juice and we actually had something real to work with, because I was finding what Nikki's talking about.
Very interesting. Well, I don't think I have any more questions at the moment, and we're just coming up on an hour. I know we've gone a little bit over our time, but Laura, you can confirm when the video will be posted on the YouTube channel. And I want to thank BC Wine Institute and the panelists for coming on the webinar today, and for making these lovely electric, tense, mineral-driven wines, because it's just, even though it's still fairly early in the day, it's hard not to pound these back. Thanks to everybody.
Well,
Thanks to everybody, and congratulations.
It's okay, Barb. You can just drink them. That's fine.
Thanks.
Making us all so thirsty this morning, Barb, panelists. No, thank you so much, and hope everyone enjoyed the discussion, and thanks for your patience through the technical difficulties. I'm literally tuning in right now on hotspot, so Wi-Fi cutting out is not ideal at this time of day. But anyways, as Barb mentioned earlier, a link to the recording will be provided on the BCWI website this afternoon, and it will also be emailed to everyone following the webinar, along with a link to register for part 2 of the vintage preview. So same day next week at 1 p.m. with our fabulous moderator, Barbara. And we'll be speaking with 3 more winemakers moving south, looking at the vintage in the Naramata Bench, South Okanagan, and Smokemean Valley. So David Lorison, I hope to see you and everyone else again next week at 1 p.m. And I think that wraps us all up. Thanks everyone for staying on time, and everyone for tuning in, and our moderator and our panelists. Great discussion. Looking forward
Thanks,
to
Laura.
2019.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Talk soon.
Bye.